Welcome back, everyone, to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 9th of June. So, as I had indicated, I am giving an extension for the journals. So, if you haven't already handed in your journal, you can hand in your journal up until this evening, the 9th, assuming you're watching this on the 9th, at 11:59 p.m. or earlier. Please send to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And please send via PDF. And what I will do is put some comments on that and return that to you. As I indicated, it's an informal response to our first major text, Frankenstein. Certainly, you can reference anything else that we've read prior to Frankenstein, but your focus should be on the Shelley novel and just some thoughts and comments and observations, approximately a page or so, but as long or as short as you'd like it to be. And I'm evaluating on a checkmark system, so I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics. That I will do with more formal assignments, such as your paper. And you'll see in the notes below, I've referenced our first paper, and that I have put the paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder, and I will talk about them in more depth next class. But I wanted to put some closure on to Frankenstein and also begin discussing persuasion, and also give you a bit of an extension in terms of discussing persuasion for your second journal. So that will be extended up until next Thursday, the 16th, since I will just be beginning our conversations with persuasion, since we're approximately a half a class to 3/4 of a class behind. But eventually we'll catch up. And we were talking about the epistolary novel technique in terms of Frankenstein, and that ultimately we don't get Victor's story until several letters into the novel with chapter 1. And we're told in chapter 1 that Victor thinks of himself, and you can see that I've indicated these quotes in the notes below, as his parents' plaything and their idol, and something better, their child. And I think this is a very ironic statement in regards to the fact that Victor creates his own child, if you will, through his own creation, and that creation, he initially creates it as a kind of plaything. But the reality is that Victor's parents don't neglect their responsibilities to Victor in the way that Victor does with his own creation. And that's probably the bigger of the two sins that Victor commits. Certainly, Victor is a kind of Prometheus, stealing knowledge of the gods and not taking responsibility for that. But more importantly, he abandons his creation rather than trying to nurture his creation. So there are a lot of parallels there with contemporary times in terms of parenthood. There are also contemporary parallels with science, things like cloning, for instance, or even artificial insemination, and what exactly is life and what is our responsibility to the creation of that life. Not that Mary Shelley would have been familiar with these sorts of terms, but we do know that ultimately she was vague enough so that it's fairly easy to use her novel and extrapolate elements of it to contemporary times, which I think is one of the smarter things that she did in terms of putting together her novel. In the first chapter, Victor also talks about how Elizabeth is introduced into his family, that she was adopted. And I mentioned last class that motherless children is a theme that we will see throughout the course of this semester. And that Elizabeth is adopted. And for Victor, till death, she was to be mine only. So Victor thinks of Elizabeth as a kind of possession. And that would not be unusual considering the way that female would have been viewed during that particular time period. It's something that I had suggested last class in reference to the creature as well, that when we learn the creature story, we can certainly empathize with the creature for wanting a companion, but yet the idea that he wants a female created purely for his own benefit is problematic in terms of issues of gender. And while the child was thin, she was also quite fair, and we talked about the Eurocentrism that's embedded within this text, even though Frankenstein is a rather progressive text in terms of the idea of the other, or that which is different from us, because the creature is ultimately rejected because of its appearance. So there are commentaries that you can extrapolate from that text about things like racism, and that ultimately we reject that which we deem to be different from ourselves. But of course, Shelley is also a product of her time, and we will see that in terms of her European bias within the text. Now, chapter 2 is where Victor talks about the world being a secret to him that he desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that he desired. And note the parallels with Walton, who starts and ultimately ends this novel. Walton is our frame, that Walton is trying to do the same thing. So this is a cautionary tale basically for Walton, or more importantly, a cautionary tale for us as reader. And there's a long literary tradition of this. I had referenced Dr. Faustus last class about a Renaissance play written by Christopher Marlowe about a scholar who is dissatisfied with the limits of human knowledge and makes a deal with the devil in order to acquire the knowledge of the gods. And not only is it in some ways an unfair deal, in the sense that Faustus never really gets the knowledge that he says he wants, such as being able to make men live eternally. But more importantly, we see how his hubris and his arrogance is going to lead to ultimately his descent, and that ultimately Faustus will be taken into hell, as a cautionary tale for us, again, as reader, to be careful about our own hubris and our own ambitions to acquire forbidden knowledge, which I've oftentimes said that Frankenstein should be a required text for all scientists, because they grapple, I think, with the ethical elements of creation, whether there be the creation be a living being, or whether it be, let's say, something like a weapon or a virus, and ultimately what the consequences of that might be. Again, not that Mary Shelley would be aware that there would once be a declaration by the creators of the nuclear bomb that if they realized how that would be used, that they would never have created it in the first place. But that Pandora's box can't be closed again. At any rate, Victor continues on in chapter 4, talking about how he's shunning his fellow creatures. And it was as if he was guilty of a crime. And I'd say that he's quite guilty of a crime. First, of trying to usurp the knowledge of the gods, and then also to create. Creation should be reserved for God or for female. And notice how Victor usurps that role as well. Again, perhaps a cautionary tale from Mary Shelley about what happens when female is excluded from the process of birthing and from the process of rearing. And also, we see how Victor, throughout the text, talks about that he feels as if that he was guilty. But of course, he is guilty, and he never takes responsibility for that. The probably most famous part of Frankenstein is the creation scene in chapter 5, which is what Mary Shelley dreamt of when she was initially in that ghostwriting competition with her friends. And I just wanted to read you briefly the beginning of that, because that's become so iconic in so many ways. For me, this would be on page 42, but again, I said this is the start of chapter 5. It was on a dreary night in November. I'll stop right here. We talked about the Gothic elements and the setting in November and the setting at night and the dreary atmosphere. All of that fits into the Gothic. And on this dreary night of November, I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse the spark of being into a lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? And as he continues on to describe this creature, his limbs were in proportion. I selected his features as beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost as the same color of the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. And of course, this description is very different than the Hollywood creature that we are presented with, which is one of the ways that I think Frankenstein has become so iconic in our society, is because of that 1931 film and the subsequent films afterwards, the sequels. And if you wanted to see a somewhat more accurate portrayal of Frankenstein, I recommend one that stars Kenneth Branagh and Robert De Niro. I believe it was done in the late 90s. Again, it's not going to necessarily be completely accurate, but we are going to at least get an accurate appearance of the creature. Though in typical Hollywood fashion, they're going to embed in much more of a love story element than what Mary Shelley gave us in Frankenstein, where the marriage between Victor and Elizabeth is much more of an arranged marriage. But if you are in the midst of persuasion, and I certainly hope you are, you'll see that this would not have been uncommon at the time, particularly for a certain class or status in society. But I'll talk about that in a moment. In chapter 6, Elizabeth, and notice how much of this novel is about letters that are sent back and forth between Victor and whether it be Elizabeth or other individuals. And then, of course, this is related through Walton, through his own letter writing. So we have letters embedded in letters embedded in letters. One could say that it gives a certain level of authenticity when one is documenting a letter, because the letter is written proof. But of course, as we talked about last class, there also is subjectivity involved in the sense that we're only getting one person's perspective. But since I've been talking about places where Shelley was so brilliant with her writing, I also wanted to point out some places where Shelley perhaps wasn't so brilliant with her writing. And this would be in chapter 6, when Elizabeth says to Victor, "Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours." Now, obviously, if Justine was a great favorite of Victor's, he wouldn't need to be reminded. This is for us as the audience so that we can get introduced to a new character. And that this is someone who was also motherless at some point and adopted into the family as if she was one of their own. And of course, she's going to be framed by the creature for William's death, which happens to be Victor's younger brother's death. And the creature, of course, will talk about how he's learned mischief and evil through humanity. And perhaps we also have to suspend some disbelief when it comes to the creature. Obviously, the creature is quite articulate. Obviously, the creature is quite intelligent. And that said, though, the idea that it can teach itself language, it can teach itself how to read, and not only read, but read some of the more difficult texts that exist in English literature, such as Paradise Lost, I think requires a certain level of disbelief, as well as the fact that the creature is even able to find books from the greatest pieces of literature. There just happens to be a satchel of books in the wilderness, and I oftentimes joke sarcastically that students, if the next time they need to buy books for class, perhaps they should look for a satchel in the wilderness. I suspect your textbooks won't be there. But nevertheless, what we do get is a creature that appreciates nature. Nature is presented as a positive and as a feminine force here. And it's when Victor isolates himself from nature that more negative consequences occur. And the creature engages initially in benevolent activities. It wants to help the DeLacy family, for instance. The creature wants to help the drowning girl, but ultimately the creature is rejected over and over again to the point that it lashes out. And think about how we can consider, once again, modern day parallels about children who don't necessarily have parental figures and are rejected by parental figures in society as a whole. Again, the nature versus nurture debate. And obviously we can have some empathy and sympathy for those individuals, but at some point we have to get to the point where we realize that that person needs to take responsibility for their actions regardless of their past history. So it's a complex issue that we still deal with today, but certainly we can see that the creature, while we have empathy for the creature, we're not necessarily supposed to support all of its actions, such as murder. And at one point, when it's assumed that Justine has committed the murder because the creature has basically framed Justine by putting a piece of jewelry on her that William would have been wearing, so that makes her appear culpable. Justine actually confesses, and she says, "I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution." In other words, she's forced by church officials to confess, or else she's going to burn in hell. And think about the cult of true womanhood, where we were talking about the elements of piety and purity and submissiveness and domesticity, and the importance of religion for a female, and this way that religion could intimidate all of its worshippers, but especially female worshippers, such as a Justine, who was threatened with excommunication and hellfire if she didn't confess. So she confessed to a lie, in effect. In chapter 11, we get the creature story, and we also get the De Lacy story. The De Lacy story is somewhat complex, but basically one of the more interesting elements is that the father De Lacy is blind. In other words, he can't be influenced by the creature's horrid appearance. Again, a message from Shelley about how oftentimes we are influenced by exteriors rather than interiors. And this is an exiled family. Basically, it turns out that the Lacys are improperly or perhaps unfairly exiled because they try to support someone who they thought was experiencing injustice. And that's part of the very complicated story that we're getting about the De Lacy family. And as the creature is exposed to all of this, he wonders in chapter 13, was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and so base? And this is where ultimately the answer is yes. And again, this is Mary Shelley trying to teach us as readers something. And we're introduced not just to the De Lacy family, but also to Safie, who is going to be promised to the De Lacy family because of ultimately their work with trying to we're trying to save a man who's been wrongly persecuted. And what ends up happening is that it turns out that Safie is going to be given away much like a possession, a prize. And again, we've seen this theme throughout Frankenstein, and we will see it throughout the semester as well. And one of the more interesting pieces, I think, is in chapter 14, where we find out that Safie's mother was a Christian Arab and taught Safie to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. So, in other words, the idea of female repression could be even worse outside of Christian traditions, or at least so it would be portrayed by Mary Shelley. Again, a certain level of Eurocentrism. But Safie's father, the man that the De Lacy family tries to assist, Safie's father loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian. So that would be Father De Lacy's son. And then the idea is that ultimately they are going to try to prevent that union from happening. But again, throughout all of this, Safie is treated much like a pawn. But she ends up running away and pursuing her love, and is successful in doing so. So I think that even though we've got a text that's very male-centric and that oftentimes presents passive female, Elizabeth is a good example because she keeps telling Victor that she will wait for him, and at one point even says that she's concerned that perhaps he's found another, and she's quite willing to move aside because his happiness is paramount to her happiness. But I think we see a certain level of strength in Safie, where she's willing to defy her father and to follow her heart. And this is the pretext that's used as to how the creature learns language, because when Safie is reunited with the de Lacy family, they've got to teach her English, and the creature just so coincidentally happens to be near enough so that he can overhear her lessons and teach himself language. And again, I think we've got to suspend some disbelief here. Remember that Mary Shelley was only a 19-year-old when she wrote this particular text. So considering what she was able to accomplish, I think that we can ignore some of these stretches of the imagination that we have to take in terms of her storytelling. And then the creature talks about how he learned about his basically creation, that he was abandoned by Victor almost immediately, and the creature ran off with the coat, and he eventually investigated the pocket in the coat to find some papers that had been taken from Victor's laboratory. So again, notice how frequently that happens, that we are given information through letters, or that someone discovers information through letters. And the creature talks about it in chapter 16. On you only I had any claim for pity and redress. At this point, the creature's been abandoned by everyone, including the blind, de Lacy, because ultimately the creature tries to approach the blind de Lacy when they are alone, but the rest of the family comes in and sees the creature's appearance and immediately makes a snap judgment. And of course, the creature has to run off. And this is where the creature finds a drowning girl. And even at this point, the creature's first sentiment is to protect and to do good and be benevolent, and tries to save the drowning girl, and he's rewarded with gunfire instead. So at that point, he's decided that he's going to enact revenge on his creator, who created him but then abandoned him. And the creature, making parallels to both Adam and Satan in Paradise Lost, both of these individuals created by God, and both of these individuals on some level or another could be said to have been abandoned by God. So chapter 16, when the creature says, on only you I had any claim for pity or redress, ultimately what the creature wants is a companion. And Victor in chapter 19 says, I felt as if I had committed some great crime. And notice how often again he seems to say that. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head, because Victor has agreed to make a companion, and then he changes his mind. But I would argue that Victor is not guiltless at all, anything but. And then when the creature realizes that Victor is going to go back on his promise, the creature says in chapter 20, I shall be with you on your wedding night. Victor, being so self-centered, being so arrogant, assumes that this is a threat against himself. And of course, if you know anything about revenge, the best way to enact revenge is not against the person that you want to hurt, but against someone that is loved by the person that you want to hurt. So that means that Elizabeth is the target, and then she happens to be murdered. Notice how in the film, this was interesting, in 1931, Elizabeth is basically locked in a room for her own safety. Again, I think this is a great deal in that she isn't given the opportunity to protect herself, and that's what makes her vulnerable. And then, of course, we get the murder of Victor's best friend, Clerval. Notice how Victor is usually in a better emotional state and often a better physical state when he's with Clerval. He's very close with Clerval, so much so that some scholars have talked about possible homoerotic tensions between the two, especially because Victor delays that arranged marriage with Elizabeth for so long. And while there isn't anything necessarily explicit in the text about that, it is certainly something to think about, especially because Victor is portrayed in many respects in a rather effeminate way. You think about him swooning and think about him being subject to illness. Again, it was very common at the time for a female to swoon, sometimes for very good reasons, because of the clothing that she was required to wear, such as the corset, which could cut off air supply. But it was also very much a fad at the time that women should seem weak, something that I had talked about when I had talked about the girl's handy book, and also something that we will see when we get to Persuasion, when we are introduced to the Elliott family and some of the women within the Elliott family. And eventually, in chapter 24, we return to Walton. So it's very easy to forget that Walton, again, is our primary storyteller. And this is where we find out that Walton is dealing with the mutinous crew. But Victor says to the crew in chapter 24, be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purpose and firm as a rock. In other words, he's talking about how they shouldn't revolt or mutiny against Walton. This is in direct contrast to the idea of Victor saying that he wants to tell Walton his story because he doesn't want Walton to duplicate Victor's mistakes. So you see how Victor vacillates throughout. He says, I'm responsible, then he says, I'm not responsible. He says that he doesn't want Walton following his footsteps, but by encouraging the crew to continue on in these dangerous conditions, he's basically encouraging Walton to follow in Victor's footsteps. So Victor never really achieves understanding or realization. In chapter 24, we're introduced to the creature, that at this point, the creature and Victor have been playing a game of cat and mouse with one another as the creature has been chasing Victor. And now ultimately, the creature makes it to its destination. Victor's gone at this point. Victor has died. And ultimately, because the creature no longer has his creator, it's basically lost its will to live, or at least its purpose for living. And again, you can think about an ostracized child in contemporary times that loves yet also hates their parent figure at the same time. And the creature says that impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested yet could not disobey. This idea of servitude and mastery and being overwhelmed by passion is something that we will see in many pieces of literature, not just in women in literature. And then at the ending, the creature says that because Victor is no longer alive, I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. The idea that the creature is going to commit suicide at this point. Again, we don't know if that happens, which leaves open the possibility of a continuation of the story. We know that the Hollywood story is very different, that the evil is destroyed, the idea of other is destroyed, and then Victor and Elizabeth have their happily ever after. There is none of that Hollywood happily ever after in this novel, but if there is any happily ever after, is that Walton has decided to turn around, and perhaps he has learned something from Victor's story so that he's not going to be continuing to pursue the knowledge that should not be pursued by humanity. And of course, the question is, do we as readers ultimately give or offer a possible happy ending by learning one of the morals of the major lessons of the text, to show humility and not to surpass the boundaries of knowledge? Will we follow that path, or will we be more like Victor and have to face the consequences? So those are just some of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of Frankenstein. Obviously, we could go on an entire semester if you wanted to about Frankenstein, but I wanted to move forward to some of the other texts. And as I indicated, I've given some suggested paper topics, and those paper topics basically are rather general because I wanted you to think more about the thesis from your perspective rather than my giving you the thesis. And one of the ways that you could sort of think about that is by considering some of the discussion questions, since we've already talked about things like the mode of delivery, the narration, the epistolary novel. And what I wanted to do with this attendance question, which would be due, and that would be on Saturday, the 11th, and at 9 a.m., though if you need additional time, please let me know. It would be in direct reference to Frankenstein. And do you think that Victor should have created a female for the creature? Why or why not? We know why the creature asks. We know some of the positives and negatives associated with that request. We know that that Victor decides to do so and then negates on his word, and then we know the consequences that follow. So again, it's not so much about there being a right or wrong answer, but more about your thought process about that. And if you'll notice, the attendance questions are at the very ending of our notes from our classes. So you can just click on that question if you wanted to in the discussion forum section. Or you could just go to straight to the discussion forum and to the question. You don't need to start a new question or a new thread. If everything is in the same thread, then everybody can easily read each other's responses. But again, regardless of whether you do it on your own thread or you do it with the class thread, I will of course respond to you. You're not necessarily required to respond to your classmates, but I am requesting that you read all of your classmates' responses and my responses to those as well. So obviously, as I said, there's much more that we could talk about in terms of Frankenstein. Just the idea of the de Lacy family, let's say Felix de Lacy, and his need to try to have justice and how ultimately he's betrayed. Or something like Agatha de Lacy, who very much fits into the female stereotype of household caretaker. But I wanted to move forward and talk a little bit about persuasion. And obviously, I think you can see from the title that the theme of persuasion is going to gently influence, which is the definition of persuasion, is going to be a major theme in this novel. I had indicated that this novel moves rather slowly, and that's very deliberate to indicate the pace of life from those of privilege in British society during this time period. We're working mostly with the landed gentry, rather than with nobility, but they still have status as opposed to the general population, which we definitely see at the very beginning when Sir Walter Elliott is so concerned with the Bartonage. In other words, where he's reading about his position in terms of status and his family's position. Keep in mind, this is a British society, so rank and hierarchy would be much more important. And even today, if you're familiar at all with British society, you'll know that sometimes actors are given the title of Sir, and that's a title of honor. And what we have as one of our main characters is Sir Walter Elliott. And I think about Sir Patrick Stewart, for instance, or Sir Ian McClellan, British actors who've been given the title of Sir as a kind of honor. And so Walter Elliott is not a Mr. In other words, he's not just purely a gentleman, but he also has some rank in society. And you'll notice in the notes below that what I've done is I've given you a list of characters because there are a good number of characters in this particular text. I highly recommend that you keep a chart of all of the characters. I divided up the characters by gender, but you could divide them up in any of a number of ways. And one of the major plot points is about marriage, and marriage in this time period is less about romance and much more about status and hierarchy. So it's a question of which marriages occur or don't occur, and particularly with those individuals who are of courting age, who are they going to choose and how will that help improve their social status? All of this is told through Anne Elliot, who happens to be one of Sir Walter Elliott's daughters. She acts much like an observer, and obviously she's not very much in approval of many of the social norms and expectations of the time, which is how this text would be seen as somewhat radical for its period, even though, again, it's rather subdued compared to texts like even Jane Eyre, let's say. Sir Walter Elliott, as you'll see under my list of male characters, he is the father of the Elliott family, and he's been widowed. And it would not be uncommon for a male who was widowed to remarry because of all of the benefits that a male could achieve through remarriage, having basically a housewife, caretaker for the home. It was much more unusual for a female who was widowed to remarry because, as we saw with the story of An Hour, the loss of benefits that would occur in remarriage, the loss of freedom and independence, especially if the widowed woman had access to financial independence. But since Sir Walter Elliott is male and he is a widower, the question is, will he remarry? And if so, what will that do in terms of the family inheritance? And we know that ultimately at this point, he's left with daughters. But first, let me talk about some of the other male figures as I have them listed in our course notes. We're also introduced to Charles Musgrove, who is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. So the youngest daughter is married, but the other two daughters are not married. So you can imagine the tensions that would be there, especially with the importance of female getting married in society, and if a female past a certain age being viewed as a kind of, quote, old maid, unquote. Frederick Wentworth is a character that we are introduced to. We find out that he used to be a suitor to Anne, who is the middle sister, and he is also the brother to a Mrs. Croft. Notice that she doesn't have the title of a lady, Lady Croft, but she is married to Mr. Croft, and they are, or I should say Admiral Croft, and they are a couple that represents the rising middle class, how things like the Navy can help individuals achieve status and rank. And Sir Walter isn't too terribly happy about that because he comes from a world where status and rank comes from birthright. And what we find out is that Frederick Wentworth, since he's single, when he returns to our storytelling and persuasion, he's going to be a very eligible bachelor, and all of the single females are going to be eyeing him. In some ways, what we're reading is a kind of soap opera, if you haven't already figured out. We get William Elliott, who's a cousin in the Elliott family. He's the heir presumptive because he is the male heir, because there are no male children who are alive. That said, things could easily change if Sir Walter Elliott were to remarry and have a male heir, which is, of course, of concern to people like William Elliott, who is counting on becoming the next heir. William Elliott is a widower. Eventually, he's courting Anne, and one of the things we find out is that he married, as many people did during the time, for money. And now he wants to marry Anne, in part because he appreciates Anne, but also he's quite interested in earning the title of the Elliott family. You can have money without title, you can have title without money, or you can have both. That's going to be one of the major elements in persuasion, is that Sir Walter Elliott used to have money and has title, but he has not taking care of his finances, particularly after the death of his wife. So now he needs to rethink his lifestyle, but still find a way to do it to maintain his dignity, at least from his perspective. We're introduced to Admiral Croft. And the Crofts, as I had indicated, are going to be important not only because they are connected to Frederick Wentworth, an eligible bachelor, but also because the Crofts end up renting Kellynch Hall, which happens to be the residence of the Elliots. They need to let it out because they can no longer afford to stay there, basically. But they need to create a story as to how they are traveling, and that ultimately this doesn't have to do with finances, so that they can retain their dignity. Captain Harville is a friend of Frederick Wentworth. He's married, so he's not going to be terribly important. But Captain Benwick is Captain Harville's friend, and he's single. His fiancée has died. His fiancée was Captain Harville's sister. So the question is, will Benwick get over his grief and court again? And if so, who will he marry? And then Charles Hayter is a Musgrove family cousin. He's single, and he's courting one of the Musgrove girls, Henrietta. Keep in mind that Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove are the parents of Mary's husband, and it would not be unusual for cousins to marry so that they can maintain a certain level of status and wealth within families, especially if there was a possibility of improving status. The female characters that we're introduced to, Elizabeth Elliott is Sir Walter's oldest daughter. She's single. Currently, she's not courting anyone, but since she's acting much in the stead of her mother, caretaking for Sir Walter Elliott, he's not too worried about this thus far. But she is getting older, and he is becoming concerned. Anne Elliot is Sir Walter's middle daughter who's single, and the question is, who will ever want to marry Anne? Because Anne supposedly has lost her bloom. Even though her sister is older, the idea is that Anne doesn't have as much physical attractiveness. And again, we know the importance of appearance for female in that time period, as well as our own time period. Mary Musgrove is Sir Walter's youngest daughter, and of course she's married to Charles Musgrove. And Lady Russell happens to be a family friend and mother figure to Anne. She is a widow and she's not courting. And again, not too surprising. She's got title and it seems like she's got a certain level of financial independence. So why would she remarry? We know that Mrs. Musgrove is Charles Musgrove's mother. And she, of course, is married to Mr. Musgrove, Charles Musgrove's father. And it's this family, basically Anne Elliott's in-laws, that allow Anne to see into a different world. As pretentious as they might be, they're not nearly as pretentious as the Elliots. So Anne gets a taste of a different worldview, one that is less concerned with money or social appearance, and also a family that has more appreciation for Anne than Anne's own family. We're introduced to Louisa Musgrove, who is a sister to Charles Musgrove. Remember, Charles Musgrove is married to Mary Musgrove, who was once Mary Elliott. Again, keeping a chart can be very helpful here. And she's of age to marry, so the question is, since she's single, who will she marry? And in fact, she's courted at one point by Wentworth because of her strong will. We're introduced to Henrietta Musgrove. So this is another Musgrove. There's Louisa Musgrove and Henrietta Musgrove. Both are sisters, both are single, both are eligible. She's, again, the sister to Charles Musgrove. Again, she's single. At this point, she's being courted by the cousin Charles Hayter. There's a Mrs. Clay, and she happens to be the oldest daughter, the oldest Elliott daughter's friend. Notice she's just a Mrs. She doesn't have title or rank. And she also is a widow, and she has children. She's the daughter of Mr. Shepherd, who happens to be the family attorney, which is how the Elliott family knows or were initially introduced to Mrs. Clay. And the question, or at least the concern, is that Mrs. Clay could be trying to court Sir Walter Elliott so that she could gain status and money. She has neither in widowhood. So being a widow wasn't necessarily always a positive thing for female if she wasn't financially secure. And then we've got a Mrs. Smith, who happens to be Anne's friend, also a widow. Notice this is not the time of divorce, so either you were married or you remained single perpetually, or you were a widow. That was the only way to get out of marriage. So Mrs. Smith, again a Mrs., not a lady, is not courting, and we find out her story as an old widow who is destitute, in effect, as the story continues. Again, another widow who is not in a position necessarily to enjoy her widowhood, or at least take advantage of her widowhood. And then we have a Mrs. Croft, who's married to the Admiral Croft, who is the sister to Frederick Wentworth, who's renting out Kelnage Hall. And of course, she's married. So this is, of course, the Croft family that is establishing itself through the Navy, the new middle rising upper class. Plus, there's some minor characters. There's a Viscountess, so that's somebody who's higher up in the hierarchy. Dalrymple, it's a relative of Sir Walter Elliott, so we see not only how Walter Elliott acts towards those beneath him, but to those above him as well. And there's the Mr. Shepherd, who's the family attorney, who of course is the father to the Mrs. Clay, who is widowed with children, who's now spending a good amount of time with Elizabeth Elliott. So, as I said, we've got quite a complex web of characters, very soap opera-like. So I encourage you to keep your own chart. What we are going to do next class is to talk a little bit about persuasion, as well as talk a good deal more about our first paper, which would probably be on either Frankenstein or persuasion, though story of an hour is also a possibility, though writing on short story can be somewhat of a different exercise than writing on a novel. And again, today's attendance question, which would be due on the 11th, which is a Saturday at 9 a.m. Should Victor, in your opinion, have created a female for the creature? So we're returning back to Frankenstein. Why or why not? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.